Shabbos lechu v'nelecha ki hi mekovoi rabracha likras Shabbos lechu v'nelecha ki hi mekovoi rabracha likras Shabbos lechu v'nelecha ki hi mekovoi rabracha likras Shabbos lechu v'nelecha ki hi mekor habracha meidosh mikedem oy nesucha soif maaser b'machshavot echila Oy lecha doidi likras kala B'nei Shabbos nekabela Oy lecha doidi likras kala
Isn't that just a beautiful song performed by my dear friend Rabbi Shlomo Katz, who lives in Efrat, Israel, near Yerushalayim. Highly recommended. That's from the album Likras Shabbos, and the song is Likras Shabbos. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? It's great to be with you. We've got a very beautiful, very special daf we're going to be teaching today as we wrap up chapter 16 of Tractate Shabbos, the second volume in the Talmud, and move on to chapter 17. This is Daf Kuf Chaf Beis, page 122. Let us light up the darkness. All right. Who's in the house with us today? Yehudit Sobel says shalom from Florence, South Carolina. James Roth says shalom from Indianapolis. Randy Lieberman Herman says shalom from Florida. Alice Gross says I'm back in Baltimore. Bill Eldridge, hello from Berkeley. John Shore says it is hot, hot, hot in Sedona, Arizona. Jim Talatagud says Jim from the Philippines. Welcome, Jim. So glad you're with us. Lucy Rom Johnson says, cool new timer. Shalom from Minnesota. Thank you, Lucy. Brian Bloomfield says, looking forward to this evening's daf in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Alan Hales says, hi from Glasgow, Scotland. Great to have you with us. Arnold Albin says, so good to be together. And says, good evening, Erev Tov, and Shalom. Alan says, what's happening there? I guess saying it to Brian, huh? And it's Yom HaShlishi here for Alan. It's already Tuesday in Glasgow. And Robin Stewart says she's in from Ohio. And Lynn is in from North Texas. And Neil says, shalom from Virginia. So grateful to be learning with this class tonight. Okay. Well, as I said, we are wrapping up chapter 16. 16 was all about what happens when a fire breaks out on Shabbos. And then by the time we got to the end of the chapter, we're looking at a little bit off the subject of the fire and whether we can put out the fire. But we got to this final Mishnah by way of, well, what happens if a Gentile comes to put out the fire for us? And we'll recall that there's a difference between the law as it was then in Talmudic times and now. If a fire breaks out now, even the smallest kind of fire, we just put it out and we just override what is normally the prohibition of extinguishing a flame on Shabbos. That's one of the forbidden labors. But the danger is so great, not only because of the change that we discussed a couple of days ago in medieval times when it just became so much more dangerous for Jews in the various communities around the world where they were subject to so much Jew hatred, but also the fact of modern times. You know, in Talmudic times, there was also less fire danger because people lived in houses made out of clay or stone. Today, where houses are mostly made out of wood, obviously it's a bigger danger, and especially in cities where we live, near a lot of houses made out of wood. So we're certainly going to be more careful, and we just put out a fire. I did omit a story yesterday that is worth mentioning today. So first, let me just read the Mishnah. This is the final Mishnah of chapter 16 here in Tractate Shabbos, the second volume of the Talmud. I'll just read it to you. Mishnah number 8. If a Gentile kindled a lamp on Shabbat for his own purposes, a Jew also uses its light. And if the Gentile kindled it for a Jew, the sages prohibited the Jew to benefit from its light. Similarly, if a Gentile drew water from a well in the public domain to give his animal to drink, a Jew can give his own animal to drink after the Gentile is done from the same water that was drawn. And if he drew the water initially for the benefit of the Jew, it is prohibited for a Jew to give his animal to drink from that water. Similarly, if a Gentile made a ramp on Shabbat to disembark from a ship, a Jew disembarks after him. And if he made the ramp for a Jew, it is prohibited. There was an incident in which Rabban Gamliel, the Nasi, right there, the head of the sages, essentially the chief rabbi, and the elders were traveling on a ship, and a Gentile made a ramp on Shabbat in order to disembark from the ship on it. And Rabban Gamliel and the elders disembarked on it as well. So we're going to unpack the Mishnah now. But the basic principle, the thing to understand here, is that on Shabbat, a Jew is prohibited to perform the 39 prohibited labors of Shabbos, the 39 labors derived from the categories of labors needed to construct the tabernacle when the children of Israel were wandering in the wilderness, and we received the Torah and the instructions to build the tabernacle, right? The first temple the temple itself was built in Jerusalem. That's what we mean by the first temple. That was 400 years later. But the tabernacle acted as the center of the faith for those first 400 years, including the 40 in the desert. So the trick is we're prohibited to do these labors. We can't get around that prohibition by asking somebody who is not prohibited, i.e. a non-Jew, we can't ask them to do the labors for us, because if they do it for us, they're acting as our agent. And when you send an agent to do something for you, right? If you send somebody to deliver a message or to deliver some money or to collect some money, any means by which somebody acts as an agent for you, so then you're responsible for the action that they take. I mean, everyone knows as an employer that if your employee does something he shouldn't have done, the employer is ultimately responsible. The buck stops with the employer. Here, this could just be a casual relationship, nothing at all as formal as an employer-employee relationship, or even an official, agent and appointer. One who appoints an agent is what? The sender. It doesn't have to be a formalized arrangement. The fact is, if even in a very informal way, if somebody does something on my behalf on Shabbos, I can't benefit from it. Now, what's interesting about this whole setup here in this Mishnah, it's quite refreshing because, especially when we get to the fact that it's going to come up in the Gemara, that if the non-Jew and the Jew know each other, then we assume that the non-Jew, unless he had a direct reason to do it for himself, that he did whatever he did for the benefit of the Jew, as a friendly courtesy, right? So this assumes a good relationship between Jews and their non-Jewish neighbors, friends, acquaintances, whoever they happen to be in the presence of on Shabbos. We assume it's a good relationship. And that's refreshing because, of course, there's been so many times in history when Jews are surrounded by people who want to kill them. I mean, and it's just times of danger and times of suspicion. And there are many laws that are really based on the fact that we're afraid, the fact that we're suspicious, the fact that we had good reason to be cautious. But here, we're going to be sort of lenient about the nature of the relationship, which is going to produce a stringency in terms of what we can how we can benefit from the labor that's permitted to a non-Jew. A non-Jew has no obligation to observe Shabbos. So if he does something that's permitted to him, but he does it for our benefit, then we cannot benefit from that thing, whether it's light or water or this ramp off the ship. But if he did it for himself, right? In other words, if we're in a room and a Gentile is there and he doesn't want to stand in the dark, so he turns on the light, well, he turned on the light because he doesn't want to stand in the dark. And then there's no problem that we can enjoy the fact that we're in a lit room, even though we were not permitted to turn on the light, because the non-Jew was not acting as our agent. He just turned on the light because he wanted the light on. Now, in these three examples, let's make sure we understand them. The first one I just said. So if the non-Jew kindles a lamp, right, he's under no obligation not to kindle fire, not to light a candle or an oil lamp on Shabbos, and in modern times, an electric lamp. He's under no obligation to refrain from doing that. So if he turns on a light so that he's not standing in the dark, we're perfectly entitled to enjoy the light in that room, and we don't have to go scurrying off to stand in a dark place. If the non-Jew on Shabbos, and remember this is a much more agricultural type of community that in Talmudic times, so if he draws water for his animals to drink on Shabbos, so it's okay that our animal can come along and if there's water left over in that trough afterward, our animal can drink from that water as well. If, and here's the ironic thing, if the non-Jew looks over at me and he says, "Oh, let me get some more water for you," then it becomes a problem because, I have to say, no, please don't. And he says, "No, it's no problem." And I can't explain to him, or maybe I can, but if he's trying to do a courtesy and be a good neighbor and just draw some water for me, I won't be able to use that water on Shabbos. And then the third example is the ramp. Now, the ramp to get off a ship, what's the malacha here, the work that is prohibited on Shabbos, is construction, right? So here what we're told is that the non-Jew, they're getting off this ship. Presumably they have a ramp, right? What does it mean that this ramp was built? But maybe the ramp needed to be adjusted somewhat and put in place with some craftsmanship so that it reaches from the ship to whatever the particularities of the dock where the ship is now tied up on Shabbos. So he constructs that ramp. Now the question is, can the Jew go down the same ramp that was constructed on Shabbos? The answer is yes in most cases, because the non-Jew wants to get off the ship too. He built that ramp so he can get off the ship. And of course the Jews can then follow in the same way that we can use the light, because the non-Jew needed light. He didn't want to stand in the dark, and the non-Jew built a ramp because he didn't want to stay on the ship. But if he was planning to just stay on the ship, and he's like, "Oh, I'm sure you guys want to get off. Let me build you a ramp," then it would be problematic. Okay, that's the basic principle. Now, yesterday, I omitted this story that was related to putting out a fire and to this idea of what a non-Jew can do for us or not do for us. And I just forgot to tell it to you. It was in my notes, but I skipped it by mistake. So I'll share it now because it's a nice story. So there was a fellow named Yosef ben Simai. He lived kind of in northern Israel, near Tzipori. And he was very wealthy because, what was his job? He had a relationship. I think he was literally an agent of the king. Because he was a steward of the king. So he had a very high and important sort of government position. He was a Jew, but he worked for presumably the Roman government at that time. So he had a big, beautiful house with a big, beautiful courtyard, and a fire broke out in his courtyard. The soldiers that were in the fortress nearby saw, I guess they had a watchtower, and they saw, "Oh my gosh, there's a fire in the courtyard of the steward of the king." So they all ran over, the soldiers and their commander, and they were ready to help him put out the fire. His name is Yosef ben Simei, right? Yosef ben Simei said to them, no, don't do it. Don't do it. I'm a Jew. I can't extinguish a fire on Shabbos. Please, just let it be. Thank you for coming, but let it be. And then a miracle was performed for Yosef ben Simei, and it rained, and it put out the fire so that there was no damage anyway. He was so grateful for the fact that the soldiers and their commander had come running over to help him put out the fire, that even though he told them, don't bother, I don't need you to help me, he rewarded them, and he gave 2 sellas, which is a valuable coin, quite valuable. He gave 2 sellas to each soldier and 50 to the commander. When the sages heard about this story, they said he needn't have told them to stop. There was no reason. I guess Yosef ben Simei was a steward of the king. He was not a sage, and he was pious. He was trying to do the right thing. He was a very pious man. He was willing to let property in his courtyard burn. But he need not have done that because, as we learned in yesterday's class, if the non-Jew comes over to put out your fire, you can encourage him to do it, but you need not dissuade him from doing it. So if they came over of their own volition to put out the fire, so that's fine. They're not acting as your agent. And as we learned yesterday, one could even say sort of out loud, but not directly to them, well, if somebody puts out this fire, there'll be a reward for them. They will not regret it. They will be rewarded. Right? And then he could settle up with them after Shabbos. I'm sure that's when he gave them the reward anyway. And so we see it's that same principle being embodied. We can't ask somebody to do something that we're not permitted to do, even if they're permitted to do it, because then they would be acting as our agent. Okay. Now, with regard to our Mishnah today, Mishnah number 8, where we had the 3 examples, right? That if the Gentile kindles a light on Shabbos and he didn't do it for us, we can benefit from that light. Or if he draws water for his animals and there's some water left over, our animals can drink from it, and we can use the ramp. And Rabban Gamliel did use the ramp to get off a ship that a non-Jew used to get off the ship. Now, we understand why the first 2 examples are there, because they demonstrate a different principle. With the light, if you turn on a light, it doesn't matter if there's 1 person in the room, 10 people in the room, 100 people in the room, they're all going to have the same amount of light to see by. But if the non-Jew draws water in his trough, well, he drew a finite amount of water, and now some of that water that he left over is going to get used by us. Are we sure that we can use it? And the answer is yes, we can use that water. It's just sitting there. He drew it but didn't need it, so our animal can drink from it. In terms of a ramp for getting off a ship, that's more similar to the light in the room. No matter whether there's 1 person, 10 people, or 100 people on the ship, they only need 1 ramp to get down off the ship. So why is that example also given? Wasn't it already taught by the fact that we can benefit from the light of the non-Jew? And the answer is that story shows that Rabban Gamliel not only taught the principle, but held by it, lived by it, right? Sometimes we'll see that the sages will say, it is permitted to do such and such, but I'm trying to live at a higher level and I'm not even going to make use of that permit. This incident was included in the Mishnah to teach us that, and it is correct to use that ramp that the non-Jew built so that he could get off the ship, as long as he didn't build it directly for the Jews so that they could get off the ship. Okay, let me check my notes. A place where this comes up in modern times is if you're in a hotel on Shabbos. And we've been in a hotel on Shabbos, and we tell the kids, and it's kind of fun. It's like everybody else is just staying in the hotel. If we're there in that same hotel on Shabbos, we're like playing a game. It's like a secret agent game that the other people in the hotel are not aware of. We've got all these restrictions, and like we have to make it work. Like, for instance, in modern hotels, they have the key card in the lock. That's problematic because if you put the key card in the lock, often a light goes on. You're causing that light to go on. You might say that, according to Rabbi Shimon, that light is the unintended consequence of what we really want to do, which is open the door. But the fact is, we're engaging an electric mechanism. It's inevitable that that light is going to go on. It's not a maybe, it's a definite thing. And so we really can't use that mechanism to get in and out of our room. Some hotels, even though they have the electric key card, there's also the mechanical key that you can use on Shabbos, and those are good hotels for religious people. Other hotels don't have that option, and what people will do is we'll insert something in the door frame, like a piece of paper between where the bolt, the spring bolt, would go into the door frame and close the door. Now there's a piece of paper there, usually like the do not disturb card. You could slip it right in there, and now you could just push the door open. It's not the most secure thing, but at least we're not violating Shabbos. Another thing that comes up in the hotel is those power doors, right? The doors with a sensor. So you need to go through some of those doors. Often there's like just a regular push door to the side, and that's fine. We could just push open the door. But we really don't want to use a door where we walk up to it so that the electricity will push it open. But if a non-Jew happens to be walking through that door, he goes through, it's going to open for him. He doesn't care if somebody else goes through the same power door in the lobby. And so we might wait a little while till somebody walks through, and then we walk behind. And like I said, it's kind of a fun game to try to be as observant as possible while staying in a hotel on Shabbos. Okay. Now, we also learn that so then the question is asked, okay, we know that if the non-Jew draws water into a trough for his animals, and then his animals don't drink all of that water, so then we can let our animals drink from it because he drew the water for himself and there was some left over. What about grass? What about the same situation, but what he does is he cuts a bunch of grass and puts it in a trough for his animals to eat. Now, and they don't eat all of the grass, can our animals now go up and eat that grass? So this is actually a different question, and this is going to relate to chapter 17, which we're about to start. That's why it's found here, and it's a nice transition. Because water, even if it's flowing in a river or flowing in a stream underground to come up in a well, and that water comes from far away, outside the Sabbath boundary. In other words, this water on Friday afternoon, it might have been several miles upstream, outside the Techum boundary, outside the outer distance that I could walk on Shabbos. But I knew that water was going to be, it's obvious the water's always flowing, and wherever that water was yesterday, it was predictable. It was in my mind that it would end up here in the well or in the river or wherever I'm going to be drawing the water. Even though it came from far away, it is not muktzeh. So muktzeh is what we're going to be talking about today as we open chapter 17. Muktzeh is the term that we use for something that is set aside, meaning it is not prepared for Shabbos. Something that I did not have in my mind that I would be using on Shabbos. It's not ready for my use on Shabbos. Grass in the ground for sure is muktzeh, right? Why? Because we can't cut grass on Shabbos. That's a form of reaping. So even if our animal was hungry, okay, and there's grass in the ground, it can go eat from the ground. That's the animal is doing it on its own. But I won't lead it to a place and then cut grass for it. So in this situation where the non-Jew cut grass on Shabbos, so that grass was not set aside. It wasn't prepared for Shabbos. He cut it for his animal. I'm actually not going to be able to take my animal to go eat that grass in the trough, lead him to the trough so that he could eat that grass because that grass wasn't prepared for Shabbos. It's a different prohibition than the idea that the non-Jew was my agent in putting grass in the trough for the animals. But what is permitted is I could just bring my animal in the area, not to the trough, just somewhere in that area. And if he happens to smell the grass and he wanders over and starts eating it after it's been abandoned by the non-Jew and his animals, so then I'm not going to stop my animal from eating it because my animal found it and ate it of its own volition. And finally, we have this beautiful little nuanced incident to end chapter 16, and this idea of benefiting from the labor of a Gentile with respect to light and kindling light on Shabbos. So Shmuel was staying by the house of Avin Toran. Let me just make sure I'm getting his name right. Yeah, Avin Toran. And Avin Toran was a non-Jew. He was a Persian. And I'm guessing that Avin Toran was a well-to-do and prominent Persian. Shmuel was certainly the most prominent sage in his region. And if he's staying by the home of Avin Toran, it's probably because it's a show of beautiful respect toward this sage of the Jews, and perhaps this leader, or some kind of upstanding, prominent citizen in the Persian community is having Shmuel stay by him over Shabbos. It's unusual for an observant Jew to stay by the home of a non-Jew over Shabbos, but it can happen, and it happened here. So once Shabbos began, the homeowner, who was not Jewish, lit a light. He kindled a light. And Shmuel knew that he was being shown respect, right, by being invited into this man's home. And so now he thought, well, I think he lit this light for me. And he's doing that because he's being respectful and considerate. And I don't want to tell him, that he shouldn't do that. So Shmuel just subtly turned away from the light. He just turned away from the light so that it wouldn't be shining on his face. He just turned away from it. But then he saw that the homeowner brought a document so that he could read by the light that he had just kindled. And then Shmuel saw, oh, he lit it for himself, not for me. Beautiful. And then he turned back to the light and was comfortable enjoying the light that was in the room. Just a tiny little nuanced incident that I think it's worth mentioning and remember because we talk a lot about these laws and we talk about the sages laying down principles that are going to be, policy matters for a whole population to live by, or at other times, arguing even passionately about what is the underlying philosophy of a law, and sometimes, behaviorally doing what they're going to do. They argue about the laws, but they also live by them, like that example of Rabban Gamliel using the ramp to get off the ship. But also here we see it's a quiet thing. So much of religious observance, it really happens in your heart, right? And it's not for other people to see or to know about. Perhaps there was a companion there with Shmuel who knew Shmuel so well that he saw this very small nuanced gesture, or maybe Shmuel reported it to a friend later. But it's just to, really bring down for us this idea that so much of our love and awe of God is a private matter. There's many public things, and we talk about them, we keep talking about them. But it's worth noting that so much of this really happens in the private sphere, and one can ask himself or herself, did I do the best that I could in honoring God in my private relationship between God and me? Okay, that wraps up chapter 16, which was primarily about what happens when a fire breaks out on Shabbos. Now we move into chapter 17, and 17 is going to be about the principle of muktzeh. So we've mentioned it a bunch of times up until now, this idea that things are set aside, and either they're prepared for Shabbos use or they're not prepared for Shabbos use. So the basic idea of a muktzeh item on Shabbos is that I assume in my mind that this is an object I would have no reason to touch on Shabbos, and therefore I'm not going to touch it on Shabbos. And the classic example is money. We don't buy things. We have no need for money on Shabbos. Another excellent example of a muktzeh item is this. Any kind of a smartphone, computer, iPad, tablet has no legitimate use on Shabbos. It's muktzeh. We don't touch it. There's sort of two understandings of what, and it's a rabbinic prohibition, right? So it's not in the Torah, it's not a biblical prohibition that you can't touch objects that have no real use on Shabbos. So why did the rabbis make this decree? Some say it's because they drew a fence around the Torah to keep us from touching objects that if we were to use them, we would come to do a malacha. We would come to do prohibited labor on Shabbos, right? Even if my phone is off, there's no reason for me to touch my phone on Shabbos. If I did, I might be, especially if by picking it up it went on, I might be very tempted to, get in there and look at the sports score or who texted me or whatever, and then I'm going to be doing all kinds of prohibited labors on Shabbos. So I just don't touch it at all. And another sort of philosophy behind muktzeh is that there's some objects that we don't touch them because it's a fence around the Torah, not to protect us from using that object from its normal use, which would lead us to do a prohibited labor, but also because we might come to carry. Right? Some things we don't touch them because if we did touch them, we might come to carry it or some other thing. It would lead to carrying, which we've spent so much time talking about in this tractate, Shabbos. There's basically three categories of objects which are muktzeh. The first is things that are repulsive. They're dirty, they're gross, there's no reason to touch them. We don't deal with dirty, disgusting things on Shabbos, so they're muktzeh. The second is items set aside because of their function, like a cell phone on Shabbos. And third is related to number two. It's items that are set aside due to monetary loss. So as we're going to see in the first Mishnah, the classic example of dealing with a muktzeh item is a hammer, right? So a hammer is normally used for construction, so we wouldn't touch the hammer. The hammer is not prepared for Shabbos. But a hammer can be used for not its intended use, but for something that is permitted on Shabbos. So if the hammer was lying around, I certainly wouldn't pick it up, so that I might come to hammer a nail. But I could use it to crack nuts. That would be okay. It's not made for cracking nuts, but I could use that hammer to crack nuts on Shabbos. And recall when we learned about cooking, I wouldn't crack a whole bunch of nuts where I would leave some of them sort of shelled for use after Shabbos, but I could crack nuts that I'm about to eat. Otherwise, it would become like extracting the edible from the inedible, and it would be prohibited. But just to crack a few nuts so that I can eat them is much more akin to just cutting our food when we're eating at dinner. If, however, I was a watchmaker and I had a hammer that was like a very tiny specialized hammer that was only used for fine jewelry, and if I were to use it to crack nuts, it might be damaged, so that would be a fully muktzeh. I wouldn't pick up that hammer at all, because certainly I never had it in my mind before Shabbos that I might use that hammer on Shabbos. Whereas a regular hammer, I wouldn't use it for its intended use, but it's sort of generally assumed that anybody might have thought in the back of their mind that, well, if I needed to crack nuts with it, I could use it to crack nuts. So that hammer wasn't fully set aside. It's generally understood that a regular hammer could be used to crack nuts on Shabbos. Okay, with that in mind, let's look at Mishnah number 1 here of chapter 17. We'll have a quick discussion here, and then I'll get to your comments and questions. Mishnah number 1 of chapter 17. All vessels may be moved on Shabbos, and their doors, which are part of these vessels, along with them, even if they were dismantled on Shabbos, as the doors of these vessels are unlike the doors of a house. So this word vessel, it's a vessel is something that contains things. And it could mean just a salad bowl or a soup bowl, but it could also be some kind of like a cooler. like a portable cooler. That's a vessel too. And that could have a door on it. It could even be something as large as an armoire, right? But if the closet was built into the wall, then it's not a vessel. Then it's part of the structure. Vessels can be moved. We have no problem, with Tupperware, like unfastening the top, reassembling it, disassembling it. Anything that doesn't require particular craftsmanship to disassemble and reassemble, that's fine. We can move it, take it apart, put it back together on Shabbos. But if it's going to require craftsmanship to put it back together, then we don't put it back together, because now we're doing what's too similar to, or actually amounts to, labor, right? Prohibited labor that is going to benefit us beyond. It is prohibited to make use of the doors of a house on Shabbos, even if they were removed from the entrance, because they are not prepared for use on Shabbos from before Shabbos. Likewise, a person may move a hammer, which is generally used for labor that is prohibited on Shabbos, and he can use it to crack nuts with it. Likewise, one may move an axe, a tool generally used to chop wood, but one can use it to cut a cake of figs with it, which is permitted on Shabbos. So too, one may move a saw to cut cheese with it, and similarly, one may move a spade to scoop dried figs with it. One may also move a winnowing shovel and a pitchfork, both of which are designated for use with crops in a barn, but on Shabbos they may be used to place food on it for a child. One is likewise permitted to use a reed or a shuttle from a spindle, which is ordinarily used in the prohibited labor of weaving, in order to insert into it food like a fork. One is permitted to move an ordinary hand needle used for sewing clothes in order to extract a thorn with it on Shabbos, and one may move a sack maker's needle, which is a stiffer, longer needle, to open a door with it. So the general principle is pretty clear, right? With tools that would normally only be used for labors of the week, we can pick up that tool and use it just for something that's permitted on Shabbos, not for its normally intended use. And we said that vessels may be moved and their doors may be removed, but we don't restore them lest we prepare for something beyond Shabbos. The key is we don't use craftsmanship on Shabbos. So a good example of that is we have kitchen cabinets, and sometimes the door of the kitchen cabinet gets like a little bit out of sorts, and they have adjustment screws. And so if I get in there and I work with the adjustment screws, okay, so then the door opens and closes nicely. That is a repair and an adjustment and an effort of craftsmanship that I would not be permitted to do on Shabbos. On Shabbos, I just get that door open so I can get the plates and glasses inside so we can have our dinner, and I don't worry about the fact that it isn't swinging nicely. I'm going to make that repair during the week, not on Shabbos. Likewise, the doors of a chicken coop. That's an example here given. While we could take the doors off of a portable, some portable furniture, it's something that's not fixed to the ground, right? Like you could take a drawer out of a chest of drawers and use that drawer to move some stuff from one part of the house to the other. And if it was a cabinet, like a curio cabinet, right? You could take the door off that if for some reason you needed to, but you couldn't put the door back on the curio cabinet because of the craftsmanship involved. With the chicken coop, which is secured to the ground, right? Because we know it's secured to the ground because the chicken's got to get in and out without escaping underneath. We cannot take the door off a chicken coop because that is too much, that's construction. Just like when we dismantle in order to, we demo, we're going to do a project to improve a house, home improvement, and we might tear down a wall and part of the house. It's really constructive labors that are prohibited on Shabbos, not destructive labors. But when we demo something in order to replace it, then the demolition is also considered construction. And so just as we can't screw the doors onto a chicken coop on Shabbos, we also can't remove the doors from a chicken coop. We can't remove the doors from a closet either, because that's part of the structure of the house, though we could remove the doors from a portable cabinet or a cooler or something like that. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let's look at your comments and questions. Bill Eldridge, question. Supposing the Gentile in question is aware of the general ruling of the rabbis that his Jewish friend cannot be the explicit beneficiary of his good deed. Let's say he was an Episcopalian who watched AT daily, for instance. Now, can the Gentile engage in artifice to give his friend a hand? Oh dear, I seem to have drawn twice as much water, silly me. Yes, certainly you can. But you have to be so loving and classy that you don't go wink, wink. Right? The wink, wink could ruin it because then he knows you did it for him and he's going to feel like you can't do it. So it's one of those cases, right, where it's sort of like here you're doing it through an action, but what's the highest form of charity, right? The highest form of charity is where the beneficiary doesn't know you did it for him. So you know you did it. You know in your heart you did it. God knows that you did it, but you can't tell him or even let him know with a wink, wink, nudge, nudge that you did it for him, because then he won't be able to use it. But it's a beautiful question, and thank you, Bill. Sharon Frant Brooks, if a non-Jew brews coffee for him or herself, they need to drink it first before the Jews can drink it? Can a person make a very large urn of coffee that is clearly not for him alone? Is that still okay? Okay, excellent question. We have, I didn't share it, but there was the example of a bathhouse, right? So a bathhouse has water heated in it, right? So it used to be quite unusual that you could take a hot bath in a home. Only the most fabulously wealthy people could do that. Everyone else, if they wanted to take a hot bath, they would go to the bathhouse. Okay. So in a town where the majority of the inhabitants are non-Jews, then that bathhouse was open on Shabbos, and the purpose of that bathhouse being open was so the non-Jews could use it on Shabbos. After Shabbat ends, a Jew can go into the bathhouse as soon as Shabbos ends because the water in the bathhouse was heated for that majority of the residents of the town. If, however, that town's majority, the majority of the residents are Jewish, then the water was heated, maybe for just the non-Jews who were going to use it during Shabbos. But because it might have entered the bath attendant's mind that it's just for the people of the town, it's too much like they heated the water and they would be our agent. So the Jews can't use it Saturday night until enough time has passed for the water to have heated up after Shabbos ended. So to answer your question, I think if the non-Jew makes an urn of coffee, well, if he's the only non-Jew around and he made this big urn, so then clearly he was just a super kind and classy person who wanted us to be able to benefit from it. And so then we couldn't. But if there were a bunch of non-Jews around and he just simply didn't drink it and he had a cup for himself, but he made it available to who was there, and there were plenty of non-Jews there, so then it's clear that he made coffee, and in his mind it could have easily been, that there should be enough coffee for the people who are around, and there are enough non-Jews that they justify making that big urn of coffee. In that case, the Jews could assume that it wasn't made for them, I would think. Lucy Rom Johnson. These prohibitions seem to give a lot of opportunity for artifice or pretense, hints, etc. How did the rabbis look at the use of artifice? Do they not view that as dangerous spiritually? I just did a little research earlier today. This idea of, are we looking for loopholes just so that we can get around what is intended to be a spiritual discipline, and therefore aren't we just undermining the spiritual discipline by these loopholes? And like a classic example of that is an Eruv, right? So we're not supposed to carry. We can carry in the courtyard of our home. We can carry in the joint courtyard of a few private homes that open onto the same courtyard if we do a little adjustment to make sure that we all understand it's a joint courtyard. And then we extended that idea, using, telephone poles and hose running up the poles and the filament wire across the poles to make this big community-wide Eruv? Are we somehow cheating and undermining the intent of the Torah? And I heard a great answer to that question, which is, if one assumes that the reason the Torah made a bunch of restrictions was to make us suffer, then the fact that we can get out of our suffering would undermine the Torah's intent. But the Torah wasn't created to make us suffer. The Torah was given to us so that we could realize our potential as human beings and so that we could soar spiritually. And if we apply our seichel, our wisdom and intelligence and knowledge, to really understanding what the precepts are, and therein discovering, well, there is a solution to a problem that wasn't contemplated. God contemplated it, but humans didn't contemplate it when the Torah was first given. But technology changed, society changed, living conditions changed, and now we have a modern situation, and we find a solution to a problem so that people can enjoy Shabbos more. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And that is why also today we use timers in our home on Shabbos, right? That didn't always exist, a timer, the technology to have a timer. Eventually they invented mechanical timers, and now we have electronic timers, and that is permitted. Right, we have that in our house, so we set the timer, and it's beautiful now. It's now that we live in the 21st century, we have timers that'll turn the upstairs lights on at a certain time and the downstairs lights at another time, and it really makes it makes the home so much more usable, right? And this goes right back to like one of the original conflicts that the sages who were expounding the oral law, a conflict they had with certain other sects who were saying, no, it's only the written law. I don't hold by the oral law. People who don't hold by the oral law are undermining Judaism. And so in that sect, they said, well, it says in the Torah, you shall not kindle a light on Shabbos. And so that must mean that I'm going to sit in the dark on Shabbos. And those people, the way they were trying to live it, is that when it got dark, that's it. They were in pitch black all that night until the next day. And that is not what the Torah intended, and that is not what we hold by, and there's no reason for that. So, that's a long way of answering the question. There is a danger if we go into it like, just how lazy can I be? Yes, then we're undermining the spiritual loftiness of the Torah. But if we're saying, okay, the Torah it's not in heaven. It was given to humans to live on earth. And if we're looking for, solutions to challenges that come up for people, which are going to allow them to take greater joy in Shabbos, then that's beautiful. What they can't do is abuse the search for those solutions. Okay. Ed Berg, what happens if you lock yourself out of your hotel room on Shabbos? Right. So then what you might do is you might go down to the front desk and say, hi, how you doing? Oh, good. I'm locked out of my room. It's just, I'm locked out. You don't say, can I have a key to open it? I'm locked out. And at that point, eventually, you might explain what's going on and be clear. It's interesting, like if you go to APAC or you go, on certain retreats in big hotels, there's a lot of hotels that are run by non-Jews who are accustomed to having large groups of religious Jews in the hotel. And then they get it, and eventually they will, because they want to help you and they want you to have a good experience. It definitely serves them to be that. And so you can't ask them to open the door for you, but neither do you have to be secretive about your predicament, right? And then they choose, for the honor of the hotel and to be thought of as a good hotel that takes care of its guests, to make sure that you get in that room. So, that's how we work it. But we really try to avoid that happening for the reasons mentioned so far. Arnold Albin, What about winding a clock on Shabbat? Is this okay? I don't remember. I've had the question myself. I didn't ask it about a clock. I asked it about a watch. Like, can I wind my mechanical watch on Shabbos? And I just confess, I can't remember. You could see, like, on the one hand, it would seem like, well, if I wind it, I'm adding energy into a mechanism that's going to be used after Shabbos. So that's problematic. On the other hand, if I need to know what time it is, I think what I ended up doing is like, I can't remember. It seemed to, my memory seems to tell me that there was a little bit of a question on this, and some do and some don't, but please Google the question and let me know. I can't remember. Lana Copiron. I have an electric sensor in my house. When I walk into the garage, the light goes on. I remove the light bulb, but I still hear a click. Is this a violation? Great question. This one I did just look up. Okay, so if you know that, like your neighbor has one of those motion sensor lights, and it's possible for you, to walk around it without incurring too much difficulty. So it's better to walk around it. But if you're not, going out there to use that light, you don't need that light. It's better to avoid it if you know it's going to go on. But we don't have to walk down the street really paranoid that neighbors have motion sensors. In our own driveway, we do the same thing. We unscrew the light in the motion sensor lights outdoors so that we can walk from our home to our garage without making that light go on. But in terms of the click, I don't think you worry about the click. The click is definitely unintended. We don't even know what the click is. I wouldn't worry about the click. I don't worry about the click. We just unscrew the bulb so that at least the circuit isn't being connected. Let's see. Not sure. Okay, so I think the question is being asked. Deborah Evans is saying, as a non-Jewish person in this life, I love that, because by the way, Judaism absolutely holds by reincarnation. We get multiple attempts at coming through here and experiencing life. So you're saying, Deborah, that you're a non-Jewish person in this life, and you're asking, what is the purpose of doing these things in this way? To not work ourselves or others purposely, to be closer to God on this day? No. Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, why do we have all these prohibitions? Listen, this week's Torah portion, Pinchas, and last week's Hukat, sometimes we look at distinctions between some categories of laws and others. That some laws just instinctively make sense to us, like don't kill, don't steal, don't bear false witness. I mean, a society is not going to work very well if people disobey laws like that. And other laws, like don't eat pork, don't turn lights on Shabbos, etc. Those laws are supra-rational, and we do them simply because God said, do it. There are effects which are unexpected, right? When you know you're doing God's will, yes, there's something that kind of turns in your heart that's very beautiful. Like there's a calm that comes from doing God's will. And because Jews have all these restrictions and non-Jews don't, this tends to create Jewish community, right? And keeping a community going, well, that's one of the strong elements that has ensured Jewish survival over these 3,000 years. There's no reason why the Jewish people are still on earth. It's miraculous. When you think of all the ancient peoples that have disappeared from this world, people who were mightier, stronger, richer, more powerful with their armies and their natural resources. I mean, this is the least likely group to still be here all these thousands of years later. Part of it is because God wants us to be around, and part of it is because God gave us these laws which force us to be in community and to study together and to learn together and to do what we're doing here. And finally, Sharon Frant Brooks says, I have a real dilemma with a young lady I work with as a therapist. She is in a traditional Jewish family and is not permitted to operate her own power wheelchair. She has a vent, so she must be in a power wheelchair. I'm sorry, I can't understand that word. So her aide, I think. So her aide has to anticipate when she has to move and where. Isn't it possible for a child like this to be able to use her wheelchair on her own? Listen, I can't answer that. These kinds of questions are very particular to the family and to the individual. And the only thing I could say is there's no rule that fits all of these situations. So this woman and her family have surely consulted with a rabbi about what's possible and what isn't. And sometimes, I'll just say that sometimes, from the outside, what looks like a great restriction that's totally unfair leads to stuff happening in the home that is unexpected and very beautiful, right? So if she has these severe limitations and on Shabbos even more limited, perhaps that has led to her parents and her siblings, just like pitching in, and they're all on the team with her. And perhaps that creates relationships and moments of giving and kindness and generosity that wouldn't exist otherwise. But I just could not comment, not knowing more specifically what's going on there. All right, my friends, that is what I've got for us today. Tomorrow we'll continue our discussion of muktzeh here in chapter 17 of Tractate Shabbos. God willing, it'll be the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Sending you all big love from the West Coast. By the way, if you're going to be up late tonight, we're going to be broadcasting live the recording of a podcast episode. You don't have to be there when it's live because it's a podcast episode and we're going to release it later. But it's going to be great. We're having a conversation with a pretty famous fellow named Naz, who you might know from Naz Daily. He's an Arab Israeli who has 26 million followers on social media, most of them on Facebook. And he recorded a 1 minute, like a really beautifully produced 1 minute video every day for 1,000 days while he was growing his audience. It became a huge Facebook watch show. He's a beautiful soul, beautiful character. And we're going to learn about his adventures and travels making Naz Daily. That's going to happen at 9 o'clock Pacific tonight. Don't worry about it if you can't catch it live. It'll be on the podcast, the AT podcast, available at our site, accidentaltalmudist.org. We'll probably release it next week or the week after. That's what I've got for us today. Sending you all big love. All the best, my holy sisters.